She didn't scream when they dragged her by the hair. That was the first thing people noticed. Not the blood matting her blonde curls, not the hunger that had carved her down to a ghost. It was the silence. A silence so loud it made the horses on the street twitch and the preacher on the saloon porch look away, suddenly fascinated by a crack in the floorboards. They called her Eleanor Shaw, though most had stopped using her name. To them, she was the barren widow, bad luck on 2 feet, a walking reminder of failed crops and dry wells. And today, the town had decided it was done with her. The men pulling her were rough. The blacksmith, a man whose hands knew only the hard language of iron and hammers, spat on the ground. "Rid of her once and for all," he growled, the words a puff of dust in the blistering August heat. The crowd that had gathered murmured their approval. They'd pulled her from behind the feed store, from a ragged tarp where she'd been curled around a small sack. Inside that sack was a single tiny baby's bonnet. Her scalp screamed in protest, but her lips remained sealed. She'd learned a long time ago that in this town, begging only sweetened the cruelty for the cruel. So she fixed her gaze on the dirt, on the swirling patterns her bare feet made as they dragged. Her mind went somewhere else, a place no one could touch. But then something pulled her back, a flicker of movement at the edge of the jeering crowd. Not a person, not really. It was a shape, shimmering and translucent, like heat rising from the sun-baked road. Eleanor's breath hitched, her heart hammered against her ribs. It was her sister Sarah. But that was impossible. Sarah had been dead for 5 long years, buried in a cemetery 3 towns over. Yet there she stood, as real as the pain in Eleanor's scalp, her form wavering but her eyes fixed on Eleanor with an unmistakable, urgent intention. The world went silent. The shouting crowd, the blacksmith's curses, the thud of her own body against the unforgiving ground. It all faded away. There was only Sarah, and Sarah was pointing, not at the crowd, not at the jailhouse they were dragging her toward. She was pointing down the street toward the shimmering heat that danced above the wagon wheels at the far end of town. Eleanor followed her dead sister's gesture, and that's when she saw them. 2 small girls. They stood barefoot in the dust, their faces flushed from the sun, but their eyes clear and steady. They couldn't have been more than 7 years old. One had a noticeable gap in her front teeth. The other dragged a worn calico doll by its neck, its little body patched with lavender thread. The men dragging Eleanor paused, confused, as the 2 children stepped directly into their path. They didn't seem afraid. They didn't seem like children at all. The girl with the doll stared right at Eleanor, her gaze so intense it felt like it could strip away all the dirt and grime and see right into her soul. And for just a second, Eleanor could have sworn the girl's eyes flickered with an unnatural, impossible blue light. A whisper, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear, passed between the 2 girls. "She sees Mama," the smaller one murmured. The taller one, the one with the gapped tooth, took another step forward. Her voice wasn't a child's plea. It was a declaration, spoken with the weight of absolute certainty. "She's coming with us." The blacksmith snorted, a harsh, ugly sound. The twins have finally lost their marbles. But nobody laughed. A strange quiet fell over the crowd. Even the crows on the church steeple went silent. The sun seemed to beat down with a new kind of intensity, a mean, watchful heat. The twins didn't flinch. They just stood there, 2 small, immovable objects in the path of the town's ugly momentum. Eleanor looked up from her knees. Her face was a mess of blood and dust, one eye already swelling shut. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a long, cold sleep. She looked past the girls, searching for Sarah's ghost, but the apparition had vanished. There was only the heat, the dust, and these 2 impossible children. The girl with the doll reached forward. Her movements were slow, gentle, like someone braiding a younger sister's hair. She began to loosen the frayed rope knotted around Eleanor's wrist. Her sister, the one with the gapped tooth, turned to face the silent crowd. She spoke again, her voice louder this time, ringing with an authority that no 7-year-old should possess. "This time," she said, her eyes sweeping over the stunned faces, "she's coming with us, now." A man in the crowd finally found his voice. "She can't have kids. She's barren. Ain't got nothing left to give this world." But before anyone could agree, a figure detached itself from the back of the crowd. He moved without a sound, his boots silent on the cracked earth. He was tall, but not in a way that demanded attention. He was broad-shouldered, his coat faded by the sun and patched at the elbows. A wide-brimmed hat cast a deep shadow over a strong jaw, and eyes that had seen too much weather and too much sorrow. He was the kind of man you didn't notice until he was already right beside you. He stopped just behind the two girls. He looked once at the rope on Eleanor's wrists. Then he looked directly into her eyes. And in that moment, the world tilted on its axis. It was a look of recognition. Impossible. Undeniable. Eleanor had seen this man before. Just once. A long, long time ago. She'd seen him on the worst day of her life. The day the flood took her child. The memory was a physical blow. She looked away, unable to bear the weight of it. The gap-toothed twin turned to the man. "She's tired, Uncle Thomas." The man, Thomas Whitaker, didn't ask questions. He didn't offer help like it was some kind of charity. He just crouched down slowly beside Eleanor and reached, not for her hands, but for the rope binding them. Eleanor flinched back, a lifetime of cruelty making her expect a blow. He paused, his hands hovering in the air. Then he stood and, without a word, offered her his arm. He didn't push it at her. He just held it there, a silent offer of stability in a world that had offered her none. Eleanor stared at his arm like it was a trap, but then one of the twins placed a small warm palm on her shoulder. The other held out the doll, its button eyes seeming to watch her with ancient knowledge. Something old and tired and nearly dead inside Eleanor's chest shifted. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was just a flicker. The ghost of what she used to call self-worth. She placed one trembling hand on Thomas's arm. Her grip was barely a touch, but he steadied her with his own. Then, still without a word, he lifted. Her feet didn't quite leave the dirt, but her weight leaned into him, like water finding a waiting cup. The crowd didn't move. No one tried to stop them, but their judgment hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the August humidity. "Wait just 1 minute." The voice was cold and authoritative. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Judge Milton Greaves stepped forward. His black coat was impeccable, his silver watch chain gleaming. He was a man who sweated authority, not perspiration. "You know the law, Whitaker," the judge said, his eyes like chips of ice. "Harboring vagrants is punishable by fine." Thomas turned slowly, his body still shielding Eleanor. "She's not a vagrant," he said, his voice a low rumble. "She's family." The judge's eyes narrowed into slits. "Family? Since when?" "Since now," the gap-toothed twin declared, slipping her small hand into Eleanor's. The judge's gaze shifted to Eleanor, a cold, scrutinizing look that made her skin crawl. There was something else in his eyes besides disdain. It was a flicker of recognition, but different from the one she'd shared with Thomas. This felt predatory, as if he knew a secret about her she'd long since forgotten. "Have we met before, ma'am?" he asked, his tone slick and suggestive. Eleanor shook her head, a familiar dread coiling in her gut. There was something about him, a nagging, ugly familiarity she just couldn't place. "Well then," the judge said after a pause that stretched on for too long, "I suppose we'll be seeing more of each other." He stepped back, but his eyes remained locked on her. "Remember, Whitaker, you're already behind on your payments. Don't give me a reason to expedite matters." Thomas didn't respond. He just turned, and with Eleanor leaning on his arm and the two girls flanking them, they started walking toward the outskirts of town. The twins walked just ahead, side by side, as if they'd been expecting this all along. As they passed the preacher, he muttered something about decency and consequences. Thomas didn't look back. Eleanor didn't cry. But as they walked, the wind picked up, soft and sudden. And by the time they reached the edge of town, the girls had begun to hum. It was a tune without words, something old and sweet and broken, like a half-remembered lullaby. Eleanor's legs buckled once. Thomas paused, adjusted her weight, and then, without a word, he lifted her into his arms and carried her the rest of the way. It was nearly evening when they reached his cabin. It sat alone on a hill, weathered and real, with a sagging porch and a chimney that leaned like a tired old man. As Thomas carried her over the threshold, Eleanor's gaze fell on a wooden cradle sitting in the corner, with small, faded stars carved into its sides. Her heart constricted, a sharp, painful squeeze. It looked so much like the one she'd had. He laid her on a small cot near the hearth. The girls lit a lamp, its golden light pushing back the shadows. One fetched a basin of water. The other poured from a kettle already simmering on the stove. Thomas pulled up a chair and just sat, waiting. No one asked her name. No one asked her story. That night, the girls made a bed on the floor with a quilt. They each held a corner and looked at Eleanor, a silent invitation to join them. She didn't. She curled up by the fire instead, wrapped in a stranger's coat, staring into the flames as if they held an answer she'd forgotten the question to. Thomas handed her a tin cup. Inside was a warm, thick broth. She sipped, and then she wept. Not loud, shaking sobs. Just silent tears, salt falling into the cup, a quiet flood of all the pain she'd held inside for so long. The girls pretended not to see. Later, as the fire dimmed, she heard one of the girls whisper in the darkness. She sees things like we do, doesn't she, Ruth? Yes, the other, whose name Eleanor now learned was May, replied. But she doesn't understand yet. Eleanor didn't ask what she was supposed to understand, and they didn't explain. Sometime after midnight, Thomas covered her with a thick wool blanket. He placed something on the floor beside her. It was an old leather-bound book, its cover soft and scratched with age. A children's book. She didn't open it, but she placed one hand on its cover before she finally fell asleep. A deep, dreamless sleep, the kind where the body, just for a moment, believes it might be safe. The next morning, Eleanor woke slow and stiff. Thomas was already outside, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood drifting through the open window. She found a dented tin basin and a rag and wiped the grime from her face. Her reflection in a cracked piece of mirror was a stranger, bruised and swollen, but with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in years. She found a needle and thread and, unasked, began stitching a tear in her skirt. Her fingers, once nimble, trembled with disuse. As she worked, the smaller twin, May, appeared in the doorway. The girl was pale, with dark circles under her eyes that seemed out of place on such a young face. "Are you unwell?" Eleanor asked, the concern in her own voice surprising her. May just shrugged. "My heart beats funny sometimes, but it's okay." She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Eleanor's mending. "You sew nice. Did you sew for your baby?" Eleanor's hands froze. The needle pricked her finger, a bright red bead of blood welling up. The world seemed to stop. How do you know about that?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. May didn't answer directly. Instead, she did something strange. She stepped forward and placed her small, cool hand directly over Eleanor's heart. "He's still here," the child said, her voice matter-of-fact. "That's why you saw Mama yesterday." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Your mother. "She died when we were born," May said simply. "But she watches us, like your baby watches you." The flood, the raging, terrible water, the feeling of her son being torn from her arms. It all came rushing back, a tidal wave of grief. And with it, another memory surfaced. The face of the stranger who had waded into that churning water, who had tried to save her son when all was lost. Thomas. It was him. It had been him all along. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was both terrifying and unbelievable. The girl's mother was Sarah's sister? No, that couldn't be right. Thomas had called her Marjorie. But the connection was there, a thread of ghosts and grief that tied them all together. Later that afternoon, Ruth took Eleanor down to the stream. May had stayed behind, too tired to join them. Ruth gathered smooth, flat stones and showed Eleanor how to skip them across the water surface. "My sister gets tired easy," Ruth explained, sending a stone dancing across the creek. "Uncle Thomas says it's because she carries extra souls." Eleanor's stone sank with a dull plop. "Extra souls?" Ruth nodded, her expression deadly serious. "May sees more than I do. The whispers from the other side. They make her heart work harder." She looked up at Eleanor, her eyes ancient and wise in her young face. "That's why we needed you. You can help her carry the weight." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, Thomas appeared on the bank above them. His face was unreadable, a mask of prairie dust and quiet sorrow. He watched them for a long moment, and Eleanor knew, with a sudden certainty, that he recognized her just as she now recognized him. "Supper's ready," was all he said. That night, after the girls were asleep, Eleanor found him on the porch steps. The stars were sharp and bright, a brilliant carpet thrown across an endless, silent sky. She sat beside him, the space between them filled with 5 years of unspoken grief. "It was you," she finally whispered, the words she'd been holding back all day. "At Crow's Creek, during the flood." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low and rough, worn down by memory. "I couldn't save him, Eleanor." The words hung between them, heavy and final. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Would it have changed anything?" he asked, and she knew he was right. "No," she admitted. "Nothing brings them back." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring out into the darkness. After I failed to save your boy, I went looking for my own sister, Marjorie. Found out she'd died in childbirth 2 towns over. Her husband had already taken off, leaving the twins with no one." He paused, the silence stretching. "Guess I was trying to make up for one failure by fixing another." "The girl," Eleanor said softly. "They're special." Thomas nodded. "Marjorie, she always saw things others didn't. The twins got it from her, only stronger." He glanced at her, his eyes catching the starlight. "May, especially. She's the one who told me about you. Said she'd been dreaming of a woman who needed us, a woman with a hole in her heart that matched the one in ours. She said you needed us just as much as we needed you." Eleanor pressed her hands into her lap, the fabric of her mended skirt rough beneath her palms. "I can't give them what they need. I'm broken, Thomas." "You're not broken," he said, his voice firm in the quiet night. "Just lost. And maybe we were meant to find each other." The next morning, Eleanor found May by the hearth, her small face pinched with pain. "Your heart?" Eleanor asked softly, kneeling beside her. May nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It hurts today." Without thinking, Eleanor gathered the child into her arms. May felt impossibly light, fragile as a bird. "What can I do?" "Just hold me," May whispered, her breath catching in a sob. "Sometimes it helps if someone else carries the weight for a while." Eleanor rocked her gently, the familiar motion dredging up a painful, long-buried tenderness. It was the same way she had once rocked her own son. Thomas found them like that when he came in from the barn. His eyes met Eleanor's over May's head, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever had brought them here, fate, coincidence, or the strange visions of 2 little girls, they were bound now, bound by the past, and bound by the desperate needs of the present. Days turned into a week. Eleanor's bruises faded from purple to a faint yellow, then disappeared altogether. The cabin no longer felt like a stranger's home. Its creaks and groans became a familiar language. The girls attached themselves to her like burrs, Ruth showing her the secret places on the property, May sitting with her for hours asking endless questions. "Did your baby have a name?" May asked one afternoon as Eleanor kneaded bread dough. The question no longer startled her. "Jacob," she said softly. "His name was Jacob." May nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. "He likes it when you say his name." Eleanor's hands stilled in the dough. You can see him, my Jacob?" "Not always," May admitted, "but I feel him. He's why my heart is special." Before Eleanor could ask what that meant, Ruth burst through the door, her face lit with alarm. "Someone's coming! A wagon on the road!" Thomas appeared from the barn, his expression darkening as the wagon came into view. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the fine black paint and polished trim. Only one person in the county owned a rig like that: Judge Milton Greaves. The wagon stopped, and the judge descended, his cold eyes surveying the property before settling on Thomas. "Whitaker, I've come to discuss our arrangement." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between the judge and the cabin door. "Nothing to discuss. I have until harvest to make payment." The judge smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. "Circumstances have changed. I'm calling in all debts. Early." His gaze slid past Thomas to where Eleanor stood in the doorway. I see your new family member is settling in nicely. Eleanor felt a chill at the way he said the word family. There was a possessive, knowing quality in his voice that disturbed her to her core. You look remarkably like someone I once knew, the judge continued, addressing her directly. A woman from Crow's Creek. Terrible business, that flood. They say she went mad after losing her child. Her husband's cousin, a dear friend of mine, told me the whole tragic tale. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Her husband's cousin. It couldn't be a coincidence. The pieces clicked into place with sickening certainty. The judge didn't just know her story, he knew her. What do you want, Greaves? Thomas demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Just what's owed to me, the judge replied smoothly. Plus interest. You have 2 weeks, Whitaker. Then I take the land. His eyes lingered on Eleanor, a flicker of something ugly in their depths. Unless, of course, you'd be willing to consider an alternative arrangement. Thomas took a step closer, his body radiating menace. Get off my property. The judge merely tipped his hat. 2 weeks. He climbed back into his wagon, but before it pulled away, he called out one last thing, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Mrs. Shaw, isn't it? Your former husband sends his regards. The dust from the judge's wagon settled, but a sense of dread remained, thick and suffocating. He knows, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. He knows who I am. Doesn't matter, Thomas said, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. It does, she insisted. My husband, Edward, he told everyone I was responsible for Jacob's death, that I ignored the warnings about the dam breaking. Her voice cracked. He wasn't entirely wrong. Thomas turned, his eyes intense. Listen to me. No one could have known how fast that water would rise. I was there, remember? But before he could say more, a small voice cut through the heavy air. He doesn't blame you. They both turned. May stood in the doorway, her face pale but her expression determined. Jacob, she clarified, he doesn't blame you. He wants you to stop blaming yourself. Eleanor stared at the child, her heart torn between a desperate need to believe and a lifetime of doubt. How can you possibly know that? May stepped forward and took Eleanor's hand. Her touch was surprisingly firm. Because he told me, the day you came, when you saw Mama's ghost, that's when he found me. She placed Eleanor's hand over her own small, rapidly beating heart. He's here. That's why my heart beats funny sometimes. It's beating for both of us. Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, hot and sudden. Thomas's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a solid, reassuring weight. The judge, Eleanor said after a moment, her voice steadier. He's my ex-husband's cousin. Thomas nodded grimly. It makes sense now. Greaves has been trying to get this land for years. There are rumors of gold in the hills beyond. Is there? No, Thomas said. But there's water. 3 natural springs that never run dry, even in the worst drought. Out here, that's worth more than gold. He looked at Eleanor, a new terrible understanding dawning in his eyes. And he knows you're here now. He thinks he can use you to get to it. Suddenly, the judge's interest wasn't just about land or money. It was about her, and the thought was more terrifying than any debt. That night, a storm rolled in, the first real rain in months. Lightning flashed, illuminating the small cabin in stark, jagged bursts. Eleanor sat with May, who had taken to her bed early, her breathing shallow. Tell me about him, May whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the thunder. About Jacob. And so Eleanor began to speak. She unspooled memories she hadn't dared touch in 5 years. She told May about Jacob's laugh, about his eyes the color of a summer sky, about the little wooden horse he carried everywhere. He still has it, May murmured, her eyes drifting closed. He shows it to me sometimes, in my dreams. Eleanor's breath caught. She sat beside the sleeping child for a long time, listening to the storm and the strange, uneven rhythm of May's heart. Something was happening here, something she couldn't explain. But for the first time in years, the crushing weight of her grief didn't feel quite so heavy. It felt shared. Later, she found Thomas at the kitchen table, papers spread out before him. Doctor bills for May. Notices of payment due. How bad is it? She asked quietly. Bad enough, he admitted, not looking up. Her heart, it gets worse every year. The doctors in town can't do much. I need to take her to a specialist in the city. He gestured at the papers. The judge knows this. He knows I'd do anything for them, including selling this place if it came to it. I'll go, she said suddenly. Back to town. I can work, send money. No, Thomas cut her off, his voice firm. That's not why the girls brought you here. Then why? She pressed, desperate for an answer. Why me? Thomas was silent for a long moment, the only sound the drumming of rain on the roof. Last winter, we nearly lost her, he began, his voice low. Then a month ago, she woke up one morning and said she dreamed of a woman who could help her heart. A woman who had lost something precious in the water, just like our family had. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the table. She described you perfectly, Eleanor. Right down to the little scar above your eyebrow. Her hand flew instinctively to the small faded mark. A long-ago gift from her husband's temper. May said you were the one, Thomas continued. She said you could see what others couldn't, and she said you could help her carry the weight. But I don't know how, Eleanor whispered, the confession a painful admission of her own helplessness. Neither do I, Thomas admitted, but May believes, and right now, that's all we have. The storm passed by dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean. Eleanor stepped outside to find Ruth sitting on the porch steps, clutching a piece of paper. What's that? Eleanor asked. Ruth handed it to her. It was a child's drawing, but the details were chillingly accurate. It showed a woman standing in swirling, angry water, her arms outstretched toward a small bundle being swept away. And floating above in the sky was the same bundle, now glowing with a soft, ethereal light. May drew it, Ruth explained. After her dream about you. Eleanor traced the lines with a trembling finger. She really sees him, Ruth nodded. May sees all the lost ones. That's why she gets so tired. They all want her to help them find their way home. She looked up at Eleanor, her eyes full of a strange, solemn wisdom. But Jacob doesn't want to go home yet. He wants to stay with May. He says he's protecting her. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of grief and wonder wash over her. Protecting her? From what? Ruth shrugged. The emptiness. May says sometimes her heart feels like it's full of holes. Jacob fills the holes. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Was it possible that what the doctors saw as a medical condition was something else entirely? Uncle Thomas is worried about the judge, Ruth said, changing the subject abruptly. He thinks he might try to take us away. Her small hand found Eleanor's. May says you'll protect us. She says you're stronger than you know. Eleanor put her arm around the child, surprised by how right the gesture felt. I hope she's right, she whispered. Over the next few days, Eleanor threw herself into the life of the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. She cleaned and cooked and mended, finding a strange peace in the simple, repetitive tasks. She learned to use a hammer and saw, helping Thomas build her a proper bed. The physical work was a balm, a way to build something new when so much of her past was in ruins. The judge was a constant, unspoken threat. One evening, Thomas returned from town, his jaw tight. He came by the forge today, Thomas said as they sat on the porch. Made me another offer for the land. What did you tell him? Told him it wasn't for sale. Thomas's voice was grim. He didn't take it well. He said there are other ways to get what a man wants. The threat hung in the air between them. Eleanor thought of her former husband, a man cut from the same cloth as the judge, a man who had discarded her when she was no longer useful to him. Eleanor, Thomas said the first time he had used her name with such deliberate softness. Whatever happens, you have a place here. You know that, right? The simple, unadorned statement pierced through the armor she had built around her heart. She could only nod, not trusting herself to speak. Later that night, unable to sleep, she crept into the girl's room. May was restless, murmuring in her sleep. Jacob, don't go. Eleanor felt a chill. I'm here, she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to May or to the spirit the child believed she housed. I'm not going anywhere. May's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with fever. He's scared, she said, her voice thin and reedy. The bad man is coming. What bad man? Eleanor asked, her pulse quickening. But May had already drifted back into a troubled sleep. Eleanor remained by her side until dawn, the child's words echoing in her mind. As the first light broke, she saw a figure walking up the road. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was the judge. But it was an older woman, Mrs. Hollister, the midwife from town. Thomas met her in the yard. Brought the medicine for the child, the midwife said, holding out a small glass bottle. Though I don't know why I bother. She's not long for this world, that one. Eleanor felt a surge of anger at the woman's callousness. Mrs. Hollister's sharp gaze shifted to Eleanor. So it's true. You've taken in Shaw's widow. Her eyes narrowed. They say she's cursed. That'll be all, Mrs. Hollister, Thomas said firmly, pressing a coin into her palm. As the midwife turned to leave, she paused. The judge was asking about her yesterday. About all of you. Be careful, Whitaker. He's not a man to cross. After she'd gone, Thomas held up the bottle. Digitalis, for her heart. It helps sometimes. Eleanor took the bottle, the dark liquid inside seeming to hold a sinister weight. May said something last night, about a bad man coming. Thomas's expression darkened. The judge. He's been making threats around town, saying he'll have this place one way or another. A terrible thought began to form in Eleanor's mind. What if it's not just about the land? What if he knows about May? About what she can do? Thomas was silent for a long moment. There have been rumors, he admitted finally, about the girls. Things they've said, things they shouldn't know. And if the judge believes those rumors, then we have more to worry about than losing the land, Thomas finished, his voice grim. There are people in this town who still believe in witchcraft, Eleanor. People the judge could easily stir up against us. The implication hung between them, cold and sharp as a winter wind. In a town like theirs, such an accusation could be a death sentence. We need to be ready, Thomas said. Eleanor clutched the medicine bottle, the glass cool against her skin. We will be. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of hammering. Thomas was reinforcing the cabin door, adding a heavy wooden bar across it. It was no longer just a precaution, it was a defense. Later that day, as she hung laundry on the line, she spotted the girls by the old oak tree at the edge of the property. May was sitting against the trunk, while Ruth stood before her, arms outstretched, chanting in a soft, sing-song voice. Jacob, Jacob, bright as day, keep my sister safe to play. Jacob, Jacob, brave and true, we will always shelter you. Curious, Eleanor approached. May's eyes were closed, her face serene. A breeze rustled the leaves above them, though the air everywhere else was still. What are you doing? Eleanor asked softly. Talking to Jacob, Ruth explained matter-of-factly. He gets restless sometimes. The rhyme helps him settle. Eleanor knelt beside them. What is he showing you today? May opened her eyes. They seemed to shimmer with an inner light, a reflection of a sky Eleanor couldn't see. He's showing us the water, she said, her voice oddly distant. The day he left you. Eleanor's chest tightened. Why? Because he wants you to remember something, May said. Something important. Something you forgot. Eleanor's mind flashed back to that terrible day. The roar of the water, the screams, the desperate, clawing struggle to hold on. What could she possibly have forgotten? It wasn't your fault, May continued, her voice taking on a strange, resonant quality that raised the hair on Eleanor's arms. The man who said it was... He lied. Understanding dawned, cold and sickening. My husband, Edward, May nodded, a slow, solemn movement. Jacob says he left you both behind. He ran first. He went to save the horses and left you to save the baby alone. The memory hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. It was true. Edward had been there when the warnings came, but he'd run for the stables, shouting something about their investment in the livestock. She had buried that detail, buried it deep beneath the suffocating weight of her own guilt. Jacob wants you to know, May said, her voice fading as her eyes drifted closed again. He wants you to forgive yourself. That evening, Eleanor told Thomas what had happened. He listened without interruption, his face a stony mask. "Do you believe it?" he finally asked. "The part about Edward leaving us?" she said, her voice shaking. "That's true. I'd forgotten." May couldn't have known that. Thomas nodded slowly. Marjorie was the same way. Knew things she shouldn't. It scared her husband. That's why he left her, I think. He was afraid of what the girls might be. "And you?" Eleanor asked softly. "Are you afraid?" Thomas met her gaze, his eyes steady and clear. "Only of failing them. Like I failed your boy." Eleanor reached across the table and for the first time took his hand. "You didn't fail Jacob," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that surprised them both. "You tried to save him when his own father ran. And you won't fail the girls. We won't fail them." His rough hand turned, his fingers lacing with hers. "No," he agreed quietly. "We won't." The next morning, 3 riders appeared on the road, backlit by the rising sun. Judge Greaves, the sheriff, and a third man carrying the black bag of a doctor. "Whitaker," the judge called, dismounting. "Official business, I'm afraid." He produced a folded document. "By order of the county court, I'm here to collect on your overdue debt." "You said I had 2 weeks," Thomas replied, his voice dangerously level. "Did I? I must have misspoken." The judge's smile was a predator's grin. "But that's not all. It has come to my attention that the children in your care may be in need of medical intervention." He gestured to the doctor. "Dr. Peterson specializes in disorders of the mind. He's very interested in meeting young May." Cold fear gripped Eleanor's heart. "May has a heart condition. She isn't sick in the mind." "So I've heard," the judge replied smoothly. "But there are also reports of unusual behavior, claiming to speak with the dead." His gaze sharpened, landing on Eleanor like a physical blow. "Much like the delusions you suffered after losing your son, Mrs. Shaw. Perhaps it runs in the family." Before anyone could react, the cabin door creaked open. May stood there, her nightgown billowing in the morning breeze, her eyes wide and unfocused. "You can't have them," she said, her voice oddly resonant. "They don't belong to you." The judge turned, his expression hardening. "Young lady, you should be—" "Jacob says you're like the other man," May interrupted, taking a step forward. "The one who ran from the water. You only want things for yourself." The judge's face went pale. "What nonsense is this?" "Not nonsense," May continued, swaying slightly. "Truth. Jacob shows me the truth. He shows me what you did to my mother." A stunned silence fell over the yard. The judge's mask of civility finally cracked, revealing the raw fury beneath. "This is proof. The child is clearly unwell, possessed by these fantasies." "She's ill," Eleanor said, moving to May's side and feeling the fever radiating from her small body. "She needs rest." "That's enough," Thomas boomed. "You have delivered your notice. Now leave." The judge straightened, his authority reasserted. "Very well. You have until sundown to vacate the premises. After that, the property belongs to me." He looked at May with a cold, clinical assessment. "As for the child, I think it's clear she requires professional care. We'll return for her this afternoon." As the men mounted their horses, May suddenly collapsed. Eleanor caught her, the child's body burning with an unnatural heat. "He's trying to take Jacob," May whispered, her eyes fluttering open, seeing something beyond the physical world. "The bad man wants to take him away." The judge surveyed them with detached satisfaction. "Sundown, Whitaker, not a minute later." With that, he rode away, leaving them with a dying child and a ticking clock. Thomas carried May inside, his face a mask of fear. "The fever's never been this high," he said, his hands shaking as he measured out the digitalis. All morning they fought the fever, but it was a losing battle. May drifted in and out of consciousness, her delirious cries for Jacob tearing at Eleanor's heart. Eleanor stepped outside, desperate for a moment of air, her eyes scanning the horizon as the sun climbed higher toward its midday peak. Sundown. The deadline was a death sentence. As she stood there, a strange shimmer appeared in the air near the old oak tree. It wavered, solidified. It was Sarah. Her sister's ghost stood beneath the tree, pointing urgently at something hidden among its gnarled roots. Heart pounding, Eleanor approached. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small, weathered wooden box. She knelt, her fingers brushing away the soil. When she looked up, Sarah was gone. With trembling hands, Eleanor opened the box. Inside was a small leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with flowing script, detailing recipes, observations, and what looked like spells or incantations. On the inside cover, a name was inscribed. Marjorie Whitaker. She raced back to the cabin. "I found something," she said, holding the journal out to Thomas. Recognition dawned on his face. Marjorie's journal? I thought it was lost. "It's about her abilities," Eleanor said, flipping through the yellowed pages. "And something else. A warning." Thomas took the journal, his eyes scanning the page she pointed to. His face went pale. "My God," he whispered. She knew. She knew what Greaves was. "What?" Eleanor pressed. "Marjorie grew up in the same town as the judge," Thomas explained, his voice grim. "His family, the Greaves, they've always been powerful. And according to this, they've always been after something our family protected." He looked up, his eyes wide with a terrible new understanding. "A power connected to this land. A power they believed our family could control. Marjorie writes that the judge's ancestor accused her great-grandmother of witchcraft to try and steal this land. It's been going on for generations." Suddenly, it wasn't just about water rights or a personal vendetta. It was an ancient feud, a battle between greed and a power they couldn't possibly understand. "Can this help May?" Eleanor asked, her voice desperate. Thomas scanned the pages. "Maybe. She writes about a ritual, to ease the burden when a spirit attaches itself to the living. But," he looked at Eleanor, "it requires someone with a connection to the spirit, someone who loved them in life." Eleanor understood. "Me," she breathed. "It has to be me." "We'll need something of Jacob's," she said, her mind racing. "The bonnet, the one I had in the sack." "We'll do it at sunset," Thomas decided. "Marjorie writes that the veil between worlds is thinnest then." As the sun began its descent, casting long, bloody shadows across the yard, they prepared. Eleanor gathered the herbs listed in the journal. Thomas built up the fire in the hearth. They moved May, still lost in her fever dream, to a pallet before the fire. Ruth knelt by her sister's head, whispering her protective rhyme. As the last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Eleanor began. She cast the herbs into the fire, and they flared with an unnatural brightness, filling the room with a sweet, earthy smoke. "Spirit of my heart, child of my body," she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Hear me now across the veil." She held the tiny, water-stained bonnet over the flames. "I offer you this token, a bridge between worlds. Follow it home if that is your path, or use it to find peace if that is your choice." The fire flared again, so brightly it forced them all to shield their eyes, and in the heart of the flames a shape appeared, small, distinct, the unmistakable form of a child, and beside it another taller figure, a woman with flowing hair. Eleanor gasped. It was Sarah, her sister, reaching for Jacob. "It's okay," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay to go with her, Jacob. Aunt Sarah will keep you safe." May's eyes flew open. They were startlingly blue, clear and focused. "He's ready," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "He's not afraid anymore." "Tell him I love him," Eleanor sobbed. May smiled, a peaceful, radiant expression. "He knows." The fire surged one last time, then settled into a steady, normal flame. The figures were gone, and in that exact moment, May's fever broke. The unnatural heat simply vanished, leaving the child in a deep, natural, healing sleep. A profound peace settled over the small cabin. The judge's deadline had come and gone, but they had faced something far greater than any mortal threat. They had bridged worlds. They had healed a wound that no medicine could touch. As darkness settled, Eleanor looked at Thomas, his face illuminated by the firelight. They had lost so much, both of them. But here, tonight, they had won something back. Not just their home, not just May's health. They had found a family, and they had found hope. But as the fire crackled in the hearth, A new, cold thought crept into Eleanor's mind. The judge had wanted this land for generations. He had been thwarted by Marjorie, and now he had been thwarted by them. A man like that wouldn't just give up. He would escalate, and Eleanor had a terrible feeling that the ghosts of the past were nothing compared to the monsters of the present. The battle for the land was over for tonight, but the war for their lives had just begun. Dawn broke, gray and uncertain. May was sleeping peacefully, her skin cool to the touch. The fever was gone, but the peace of the previous night had evaporated with the morning mist. "He'll come today," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Thomas stood in the doorway, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion but clear with purpose. "I know." He stepped into the room, his gaze falling on Eleanor, then on the sleeping girls. "Eleanor, last night, what you did for May, for Jacob. Thank you doesn't seem enough." "It was for me, too," she admitted. "I needed to let him go." "And have you?" She considered it. The ache in her heart was still there, a familiar companion, but it was different, lighter. "He's still with us," she said, looking at May's peaceful face. "Just not in the same way." Before Thomas could respond, they heard hoofbeats. Not the thunder of a posse, but a single rider. A young boy from town reined in, his face pale. "Message for you, Mr. Whitaker," he stammered, handing over a folded paper. "From the sheriff. Urgent." Thomas's expression darkened as he read. He looked up, his eyes hard as stone. "It's a formal notice. The county court is holding a hearing, tomorrow morning, to determine custody of Ruth and May." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "He's claiming they're in danger here," Thomas said, his voice tight with fury. "That you're an unstable influence. He's going to use the law to take them away from us." Over a breakfast none of them could eat, they explained the situation to the girls. "But they can't take us away," May said with unwavering certainty. "We belong here, with you and Uncle Thomas." Eleanor's heart ached at the child's simple faith, but she knew faith wouldn't be enough in a courtroom run by the judge's allies. "What do we do?" she asked Thomas, once the girls were outside. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. "We prepare. We fight." He paused, his gaze meeting hers, intense and serious. "And there's one other thing we could do, something that might strengthen our case." Eleanor waited. "We could get married," he said simply, "before the hearing. It would show the court we're a stable, proper family." Eleanor stared at him, speechless. Marriage? It was a desperate, practical solution. But as she looked into his steady, honest eyes, she knew it was more than that. He wasn't proposing out of convenience. He was proposing a future. "You don't have to answer now," he said quietly. "Just think about it." They left for town immediately, deciding to spend the night at Mrs. Hollister's cottage on the outskirts. The old midwife was waiting for them. "Took you long enough," she grumbled. "The whole town's buzzing. The judge has been busy, painting you as a devil-worshipping lunatic." She handed Eleanor a simple dress of deep blue. This was Marjorie's. "You'll want to look respectable." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying speed. Mrs. Hollister knew about Marjorie's abilities. In fact, she had been Marjorie's teacher. "The judge knows about me too," the old woman said grimly. "He's been trying to run me out of this county for years. He's not just after your land. He's trying to wipe out anyone who knows the truth about his family's history." And then came the final, devastating blow. "Your ex-husband is in town, Mrs. Shaw," Mrs. Hollister said, her eyes filled with a grim pity. "Edward, the judge brought him here. He'll be testifying against you tomorrow." The world swam before Eleanor's eyes. Edward. Here. The man who had abandoned her, who had branded her as mad. He was the judge's final, perfect weapon. That night, as the girls slept in the next room, Thomas took her hand. "I meant what I said, Eleanor. Not just for the hearing. For us. For the family we could be." She looked at him, at this man who had stood by her, who had fought for her, who had seen past the broken woman to the person she could be. He was offering her a home, a family, a future. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, to all of it." The next morning at 9 o'clock, they stood before Reverend Green in the empty town church. The girls were their witnesses. The words were simple, the ceremony brief. But when Thomas slid a plain gold band, Marjorie's ring, onto her finger, it felt more real, more binding than any vow she had ever made. They walked into the courthouse at 10 o'clock. Thomas Whitaker, his new wife Eleanor, and their two daughters. A family, ready for war. The courtroom was a circus. The judge sat at the prosecutor's table, smug and confident, and beside him sat Edward. He looked older, harder, but his eyes held the same cold judgment she remembered. He was the ghost she couldn't banish. The judge painted them as monsters, a debt-ridden farmer and a delusional widow, leading two innocent children into a world of witchcraft and madness. Then Edward took the stand. He spoke in a calm, reasonable voice that made his words all the more poisonous. He recounted Eleanor's grief, her obsession with Jacob's spirit, her fragile mental state. He was destroying her, piece by piece, with the intimacy of a man who had once known all her secrets. Through it all, Eleanor sat tall, her hand holding May's, her other resting on Thomas's arm. She would not let them break her. Not again. When it was her turn, she spoke from the heart. She spoke of loss, but also of healing. She spoke of a love that death could not extinguish. These girls, she said, her voice ringing with passion, saw something in me I had forgotten existed. They gave me a family, and I will protect them with my life. Finally, the visiting judge, a stern-faced man named Wilson, made a stunning announcement. I will hear from the children themselves, he declared, in my chambers, alone. The wait was agonizing. When the girls returned, their faces were solemn and unreadable. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. The room fell silent. Having heard all testimony, he began, his eyes sweeping over the courtroom, and having spoken with the children, I find this to be a most unusual case. He paused, his gaze landing on Judge Greaves. It is clear to me there are motivations at work here beyond concern for the children's welfare. A gasp went through the crowd. This court deals in facts, not superstition, he continued, and the facts are these. The children are healthy, they are happy, and they are deeply attached to Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker. He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Custody is granted to Thomas and Eleanor Whitaker. This petition is denied. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then the room erupted. Eleanor pulled the girls into a fierce hug, tears of relief streaming down her face. Thomas's arm came around all of them, a solid protective shield. But Judge Wilson wasn't finished. Furthermore, he announced, his voice booming, I am initiating a formal inquiry into the management of county lands and Judge Greaves's personal business dealings. Judge Greaves's face went white. He stood, gathered his papers, and stormed from the courtroom, his empire beginning to crumble around him. Edward lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting Eleanor's across the room. She saw no victory in his defeat, only a hollow, empty man. Then he too was gone. It's over, Thomas whispered. But as they left the courthouse, Mrs. Hollister grabbed her arm. Don't celebrate yet, she warned. You didn't just beat him. You humiliated him. A cornered snake is the most dangerous kind. Her words proved prophetic. As they approached their wagon, they saw it. A small cloth doll, just like the one May carried, lay on the seat. Its head had been torn off, its stuffing pulled out. A silent, vicious promise. They raced out of town, the setting sun at their backs. They were miles from home when they first saw the smoke, a thick black pillar rising against the twilight sky, rising from the direction of their farm. No, Eleanor breathed, her blood running cold. They crested the last hill and saw the horror. The barn was a raging inferno, and silhouetted against the flames were 4 riders, the judge, Edward, and 2 hired thugs. They were splashing oil on the walls of the cabin. They're going to burn it all, Thomas said, his voice a raw whisper of disbelief and rage. He reached for his rifle. No, Eleanor said, grabbing his arm. The important things aren't in that house. They're right here. She looked at the terrified faces of the girls. We leave. We run now, while they're distracted. But just as they started to back away, May broke free. She ran, not away, but toward the old oak tree by the creek. May! Eleanor screamed, forgetting all caution. I can't leave Jacob, the child cried, digging frantically at the earth where the spirit bonnet was buried. The riders saw them. They spurred their horses, charging across the field, whooping like devils. It was over. They were trapped. Found it, May shrieked, pulling the small dirt-stained bonnet from the ground. And then the world changed. The bonnet began to glow. A soft, pulsating blue light that grew brighter and brighter, pushing back the shadows of the twilight. The charging horses reared, screaming in terror. A wind rose from nowhere, whipping the leaves of the old oak into a frenzy. May held the glowing bonnet aloft. Jacob, she cried, help us. The creek exploded. Water erupted from the banks, not as a flood, but as a solid, churning wall. It rose 20 feet high, shimmering and impossible, forming a barrier between the family and the riders. The water was alive, and inside it, shapes began to form. A woman with flowing hair, Marjorie. A small boy with eyes the color of a summer sky, Jacob. The spirits of the land had answered. Witchcraft! The judge screamed, his face a mask of terror. Shoot them! One of the thugs raised a pistol, but before he could fire, the water wall surged forward. It washed over the men, not with the force to kill, but with an ancient, undeniable power that swept them from their saddles and sent them fleeing in a panicked, chaotic rout. The water receded as quickly as it had appeared, the spectral figures dissolving back into the stream. The silence that followed was profound. May stood, holding the bonnet, which no longer glowed. See? She said simply. Jacob protected us. Eleanor looked at the smoldering ruins of their barn, at the oil-soaked walls of their home, and then at the faces of her family. Thomas, Ruth, May. They had lost almost everything, but they had survived. They walked back to the cabin. On the porch step, untouched by the oil, was a small bundle. Inside was a jar of preserves and a note. Not everyone in town follows the judge, it read. We stand with you, friends. That night, they slept in their damaged home, the smell of smoke still thick in the air. As the girls slept, Eleanor and Thomas sat on the porch, his arm around her. Will they come back? She asked. No, he said. Not after what they saw tonight. Some fears are too powerful to face twice. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of profound peace settling over her for the first time in her life. The world was full of monsters, yes, but it was also full of miracles. Grief could be a prison, but love was a key. It could unlock worlds. It could calm storms. It could build a home, even in the ashes. They would rebuild. They would heal. They were a family, forged in fire and loss, protected by ghosts and bound by a love that was stronger than death itself. This was their land. This was their home, and they were never, ever leaving. If you believe that the bonds of family can't be broken, not by hatred, not by distance, and not even by death, then hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories out there that prove the world is far more magical than we're led to believe, and we're going to find them together.